so I am in my serious corner here. I would normally be out in the garden trying to clear some brush to expand my garden area, but it's just been the soggiest summer ever, and it's not raining right now, but it's just crappy out. And so it does give me an opportunity to do a few videos that I've been wanting to do. I'd like to be doing in the future some kind of movie review, book review things, some fun, but some kind of on more serious topics like animal rights and racism and things like that. And I should call this Politics and Religion at the Dinner Table will be the series. But yeah, so I read one book, months and months ago, called An Introduction to Ethics by Deigh, spelled it Deigh. And I was prompted to do that by watching a YouTube channel by Vegan Footsoldier, and he talks a lot about the philosophy of ethics, kind of specifically as it deals with animal rights. And I wanted to know, kind of be able to understand the terminology so I could understand what he was talking about in the videos. And I don't know if I would recommend this book or not. I wanted something, concise, and, it's pretty good. It could have used some more examples as part of explanation, but it was pretty good. And so then Vegan Footsoldier had a couple of videos dealing with the author and philosopher Peter Singer. And he had a couple videos, one by Tom Regan, where the interviewer said to him, so Peter Singer is for bigger cages, whereas you, Tom Regan, are for empty cages. And Regan didn't, he went on to have some explanations about, his thinking on Peter Singer, but he didn't, disavow that wasn't how he felt about Peter Singer. Gary Francione said, there was another video that Footsoldier did on Gary Francione, and he said, I see Peter Singer as an animal exploiter. That was Gary Francione's words. And so I thought it was really curious that a person who would write a book called Animal Liberation would be somebody who was an animal exploiter and somebody who wanted animals in cages. So that just seemed really odd to me. So I did read this book, but in order to be able to read my next book, I felt like I really need to do a little book review on this before I forget kind of the nuances and the details of what I'd read. So I want to do that, and then I'm going to be reading Tom Regan's book, The Case for Animal Rights. So then I can kind of see his perspective. Animal Liberation. So it was written in 1975 originally, and the latest update was in 2009. And so it does feel, sometimes you're reading through it, it feels a little bit dated, but I kind of like that you get that earlier perspective, and he does talk about, what has changed or what maybe some things that just haven't changed much at all. So he starts out by talking about animal liberation, which is the title of his book. And he said, animal liberation may sound more like a parody of other liberation movements than a serious objective. The idea of the rights of animals actually was once used to parody the case for women's rights. When Mary Wollstonecraft, a forerunner of today's feminists, published her Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, her views were widely regarded as absurd. And it goes on to say, if the argument for equality was sound when applied to women, why should it not be applied to dogs, cats, and horses? The reasoning seemed to hold for these brutes too, yet to hold that brutes had rights was manifestly absurd. And so he kind of puts that into perspective. Back before women had rights, it seemed kind of silly that they would be allowed to vote or hold, property and things like that. And that seems kind of crazy to us today. Like, how could people have thought that? And it calls into question, though, some of the things that we might think now that 50 to 100 years from now, we look back on and we say, oh my gosh, how did we think like that? The extension of the basic principle of equality from one group to another does not imply that we treat both groups in exactly the same way or grant exactly the same rights to both groups. Whether we should do so will depend on the nature of the members of the two groups. The basic principle of equality does not require equal or identical treatment. It requires equal consideration. And so he's not talking about, okay, let's give chickens the right to vote. He starts to define the word speciesism. So he says it is on this basis that the case against racism and the case against sexism must both ultimately rest. And it is in accordance with this principle that the attitude that we call speciesism, by analogy with racism, must also be condemned. Speciesism, the word is not an attractive one, but I can think of no better term, and I agree with him, what a silly word, right? Is a prejudice or attitude of bias in favor of the interests of the members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. He says, if possessing a higher degree of intelligence does not entitle one human to use another for his or her own ends, how can it entitle humans to exploit non-humans for the same purpose? Well, they're not as intelligent as us, so we can use them however we want. Where we wouldn't say that within humans, if somebody's smarter and more capable than somebody else, we don't say, well, then they have the right to do whatever they want with somebody who is not as smart as them or capable. So then he goes on to talk about, the thinking of the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, and talking about specifically why we might need to give consideration to non-human animals. And he says, in this passage, Bentham points to the capacity for suffering as the vital characteristic that gives a being the right to equal consideration. The capacity for suffering, or more strictly, for suffering and or enjoyment of happiness, is not just another characteristic like the capacity for language or higher mathematics. And so then that's essentially the basis then of his thinking that we should be giving moral consideration to animals, in that they suffer as we do, they enjoy life as we do, not necessarily exactly as we do, but they have that capacity, and so we should allow them the right to happiness and not suffering to the extent that we can. And then he talks about kind of differentiating suffering versus killing. So he says, the wrongness of killing a being is more complicated. I have kept and shall continue to keep the question of killing in the background because the present state of human tyranny over other species, the more simple, straightforward principle of equal consideration of pain or pleasure, is sufficient basis for identifying and protesting against all the major abuses of animals that human beings practice. Nevertheless, it is necessary to say something about killing. So here he's saying, we don't need to get into talking about whether it's right or wrong to kill an animal, because the things that we do to animals creates great suffering to these animals. And so all you have to do is say, if you say we're not going to allow those things that cause animals to suffer, then you get rid of the exploitation just through that, and you don't have to even think about whether it's okay to kill or not kill an animal. But he does then go on to talk about why he thinks it isn't right to just go killing animals willy-nilly just for our own uses. And he goes into what is called his marginal cases argument. And he says, assume that, as sometimes happens, an infant has been born with massive and irreparable brain damage. The damage is so severe that the infant can never be any more than a human vegetable, unable to talk, recognize other people, act independently of others, or develop a sense of self-awareness. Legally, the doctor should not kill the baby, even if the parents request it, as he talks about earlier. And in this respect, the law reflects the sanctity of life view. Yet people who would say that this about the infant do not object to the killing of non-human animals. How can they justify their different judgments? Adult chimpanzees, dogs, pigs, and members of many other species far surpass the brain-damaged infant in their ability to relate to others, act independently, be self-aware, and any other capacity that could reasonably be said to give value to life. So he says, to avoid speciesism, we must allow that beings who are similar in all relevant respects have a similar right to life, and mere membership in our own biological species cannot be a morally relevant criterion for this right. Within these limits, we could still hold, for instance, that it is worse to kill a normal adult human with a capacity for self-awareness and the ability to plan for the future and have meaningful relationships with others than it is to kill a mouse, which presumably does not share all of these characteristics. So he does talk about then, that does call into question, if we are willing to, kill a cockroach in our house or, slap a mosquito and kill it. Is there a point with humans where we might say, this really isn't a life, this isn't a life worth living? But then that gets into the questions of like euthanasia and stuff. And he says, since the main concern of this book is with ethical questions having to do with animals and not with the morality of euthanasia, I shall not attempt to settle this issue finally. What we need is some middle position that would avoid speciesism, but would not make the lives of the retarded and senile as cheap as the lives of pigs and dogs now are, or make the lives of pigs and dogs so sacrosanct that we think it wrong to put them out of hopeless misery. What we must do is bring non-human animals within our sphere of moral concern and cease to treat their lives as expendable for whatever trivial purposes we may have. So he spends a lot of time in this book on two topics, and he explains why. He says, this book is not a compendium of all the nasty things that we do to animals. Instead, I have chosen two central illustrations of speciesism in practice. He says, one of them, experimentation on animals, is promoted by the government we elect and is largely paid for out of the taxes we pay. The other, rearing animals for food, is possible only because most people buy and eat the products of their practice. He says that they cause more suffering to a greater number of animals than anything else that humans beings do. And so that's why he explains that he's talking about these things. And that he spends quite a bit of time on both of these topics. And so he starts out talking about experimentation on animals and really kind of explains why like so much of it really isn't even something that even benefits humans. It's really has gotten to be kind of a thing where, laboratories and universities do this experimentation, they get funding for it, and so it kind of self-perpetuates. And his thinking about how to resolve the issue is using an ethics committee. And so he said, in the United States, where the present lack of control over experimentation allows the kind of experiments described, so he described all these pretty awful things. In the preceding pages, a minimum first step would be a requirement that no experiment be conducted without prior approval from an ethics committee that includes animal welfare representatives and is authorized to refuse approval to experiments when it does not consider that the potential benefits outweigh the harm to the animals. And so again, here a person can say, well, look, he thinks it's okay to experiment on animals. It's just whether some, a little committee is going to agree to it or not. But he does this out of a practical reason, and he explains that. He says, in a society that is fundamentally speciesist, there is no quick solution to such difficulties with ethics committees. For this reason, some animal liberationists will have nothing to do with them. Instead, they demand the total and immediate elimination of all animal experimentation. I mean, it sounds like that's what we ought to do, right? Just none of it right now. Such demands have been put forward many times during the last century and a half of anti-vivisection activity, but they have shown no sign of winning over the majority of voters in our country. Meanwhile, the number of animals suffering in laboratories continued to grow until the recent breakthroughs described earlier in this chapter. These breakthroughs resulted from the work of people who found a way around the all or nothing mentality that had effectively meant nothing as far as the animals were concerned. And so that's what he's talking about. So if we demand that everything stop now, we're not going to experiment on animals, we're going to continue experimenting on animals without any controls at all. He says one reason the demand for immediate abolition of animal experimentation has failed to persuade the public is that experimenters respond that to accept this demand is to give up the prospect of finding a cure for major diseases that kill us and our children. And so that's what they can say, hey, we do this so that we can, take care of these terrible diseases. And what he explains is that actually, he's explained in his previous pages here that most of this experimentation is not necessary and not something that's going to help with major disease breakthroughs. And that's why he said, if you could put this in front of an ethics committee that included people concerned with animal rights, then they could decide, and whether this really was, whether each particular experiment was really necessary. And in that way, you get rid of most animal experimentation. So again, to reiterate, he says, the immediate task then is to work for these partial goals, which can be seen as milestones on the long march to the elimination of all exploitation of sentient animals. There you go. And so, yeah, you can disagree with how he feels like it is best to reach that goal, but you can't say that he doesn't have that goal in mind. So then he goes on to talk about using animals, raising them for food. And he says, the use and abuse of animals raised for food far exceeds in sheer numbers of animals affected any other kind of mistreatment. And he's mostly talking about factory farming, although he does talk about other types of farming. But he says, in general, we are ignorant of the abuse of living creatures that lies behind the food we eat. Buying food in a store or restaurant is the culmination of a long process of which all but the end product is delicately screened from our eyes. We buy our meat and poultry in neat plastic packages. It hardly bleeds. And so, yeah, that's what he's talking about, is that, we don't know where our food comes from. We don't know what suffering is involved in it. And so that kind of suffering kind of continues. And he explains, he says, it's not practically possible to rear animals for food on a large scale without inflicting considerable suffering, cramming them together in cages and, and the like. Possibly it could be done on a small scale, but we could never feed today's huge urban populations with meat raised in this manner. Whatever the theoretical possibilities of rearing animals without suffering may be, the fact is that the meat available from butchers and supermarkets comes from animals who were not treated with any real consideration at all while being reared. So we must ask ourselves not, is it ever right to eat meat, but is it right to eat this meat? Here, I think that those who are opposed to the needless killing of animals and those who oppose only the infliction of suffering must join together and give the same negative answer. So again, he's just talking about all of our common view, because I think it's most common that people think that that animals shouldn't suffer, that, well, they are suffering. And so whether you're an animal, you believe in no exploitation of animals, or you believe that it's okay to use animals as long as they don't suffer, in any case, they do suffer in our current system. So he's made his argument against experimentation of animals and against the rearing of animals for food. And then he talks about, well, then what can we do about it? And he says, drawing precise lines is always difficult. I shall make some suggestions, but the reader might well find what I say here less convincing than what I've said before about the more clear-cut cases. You must decide for yourself where you are going to draw the line, and your decision may not coincide with mine. This doesn't matter all that much. We can distinguish bald men from men who are not bald without deciding every borderline case. It is agreement on the fundamentals that is important. So I hope that anyone who has read this far will recognize the moral necessity of refusing to buy or eat the flesh of or other products of animals who have been reared in modern factory farm conditions. This is the clearest case of all. And that's why in the vegan definition, it says that we don't want to exploit animals to the extent practical and possible, because, you could get really crazy. And so then a person could look at Peter Singer here and say, oh, well, he thinks it's okay to do this, or he thinks it's okay to do that. And I don't agree with it. But what he's saying here is that, it's not the precise line that's important. It's the fundamentals that are important. And he does say, though, that vegans then are right to say that we ought not to use dairy products. They are living demonstrations of the practicality and nutritional soundness of a diet that is totally free from the exploitation of other animals. At the same time, it should be said that in our present speciesist world, it's not easy to keep so strictly to what is morally right. A reasonable and defensible plan of action is to change your diet at a measured pace with what you can feel comfortable. And yes, I agree with him there. I mean, I did that myself, and right now in our society, it's morally acceptable, and it's actually seen as kind of a requirement that that one eat meat and other animal products and use animal products. And so to demonize people for that is kind of, I don't think, right. And I think that anybody that tries to take some steps to not exploit animals, I think that that's good too. That's not to say that I've seen some people say, well, like that I have to eat eggs, or something like that. And they say, well, I have to do this or that because I can't get that vitamin A or things that aren't scientifically defensible. And so I don't agree with that, because that in itself is its own misinformation that, that just kind of confuses people, So, it's one thing to say, I'm not willing to take all these other steps. This is what I'm doing right now to reduce my exploitation of animals. But somebody who says, well, I have to eat eggs, or I have to eat meat or whatever because of such and such vitamin or something like that, it's not even scientifically defensible. And so I have a problem with that. And I think that people need to, that information needs to be corrected. He goes into a whole section on religion and its place in kind of perpetuating the domination of animals. And I would say I disagree with, it's an interesting concept, and maybe perpetuating is a word that could be used, but you can say like there's different religions, but I'm more familiar with the Christian religion and the Bible, and you can look in the Bible for support on either side. You could say that there were Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and all they ate were plants initially, and so that's really what we're intended for. And it wasn't until we had done something wrong that we were cast out of the Garden of Eden. And so it isn't religion; it's something that we've decided for ourselves. And I would say that our use of animals came from just necessity. Like, we were out there scraping around just like any other creatures, and trying to get food when we could and not starve. And that's where all that came from, because we did. And it's only now in a day and age where maybe we don't have to, that we can now talk about, well, should we? Then he does finally go into talking about killing of animals and whether that's allowed or not. And this is the huge controversy. The argument we are now considering raises the issue of the wrongness of killing, an issue which, because it is so much more complicated than the wrongness of inflicting suffering, I have kept in the background up to this point. He goes on to say, the real difficulty arises when we consider beings not capable of having desires for the future. He then says, but in the absence of some form of mental continuity, it is not easy to explain why the loss to the animal killed is not, from an impartial point of view, made good by the creation of a new animal who will lead an equally pleasant life. So you have an animal that's living for a few years, it doesn't have a sense of its own life, and so then you kill it, you eat it, and then another one is bred into existence, and it's enjoying its life. So does it really matter if you've killed that animal? But he says, I still have doubts about this issue. Nobody ever quotes that part of this book. So he gives 4 different reasons for why the idea that he's raised may not be correct. So he's essentially kind of refuting his own argument. On a purely practical level, one can say this: killing animals for food, except when necessary for sheer survival, makes us think of them as objects we can use casually for our own non-essential purposes. So it puts us in this mindset, when we really don't need them, then why are we killing them? And then it makes you think, well, I can just treat them however I want, right? So he says, if this projection is not persuasive, though, the argument we are considering still remains very limited in its application. It certainly does not justify eating meat from factory-produced animals, because still, those animals, we morally, I think, agree that animals shouldn't be made to suffer unnecessarily, and yet we're eating these animals from factory-run farms, and so, we wouldn't allow that anyway. So then he goes on in his kind of third rebuttal here of his own argument. At the most, the argument for the benefit of bringing a being into existence could justify continuing to eat free-range animals of a species incapable of having desires for the future, who have a pleasant existence in a social group suited to their behavioral needs, and are then killed quickly and without pain. I can respect conscientious people who take care to eat only meat that comes from such animals, but I suspect that unless they live on a farm where they can look after their own animals, they will in practice be very nearly vegetarian anyway. And so again, it's the practicality of it. There may be some people who have their own farm and have their own animals and can take care of them, and that they have lives that are natural lives and then can kill them quickly and painlessly. But that's so few people. Most people would say that they would like that and they don't want animals to suffer, but they do eat animals that suffer, raised by someone else. And so then he says one final point on the argument that the loss of an animal is compensated for by the creation of a new one. He said, if it were good to bring beings into existence, then presumably, other things being equal, we ought to bring as many humans as possible into existence too. Then the argument may get turned on its head. Since more humans may be fed if we do not feed our grain to the livestock, the offshoot of the argument is that after all, that we ought to become vegetarians. And I would say in that case too is like that we don't really know what a lot of animals, their capacities still. We don't know. They certainly have an understanding of the past. You know, a lot of animals have an understanding of what happened to them before, and they know what's going to happen again. In the beginning of the book, he talked about why he was talking about specifically experimentation on animals and rearing animals for food. And he said, to stop them, we must change the policies of our government, and we must change our own lives to the extent of changing our diet. If these officially promoted and almost universally accepted forms of speciesism can be abolished, abolition of other speciesist practices cannot be far behind. And so this, I think, is the crux of the thing, is that Peter Singer has a goal of animal liberation, but he presents practical steps to work towards that goal, steps that he thinks are reasonable and are workable and will get us to that goal, whereas with holding a hard line, we won't make it to that goal. And I would agree with him. At this point, I agree with that idea. But we can't then take his ideas about practical steps and say those are his goals. And that's what's being done here. People are taking his words out of context and his ideas out of context and saying that Peter Singer just wants bigger cages. He just wants things more comfortable for the animals, and that he's actually an animal exploiter and supports animal exploitation. And that's couldn't be farther from the truth. But read the book yourself and decide for yourself.